Joel, welcome to the Decision Making Studio podcast. This is a pleasure. You're joining us from Sydney. I think we're going to have a wonderful conversation. Welcome.
Thanks, Ben. It's a pleasure. Looking forward to it.
So this is, first of all, your book is fabulous. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think my listeners are going to get a lot out of the conversation and the book. So congratulations, first and foremost, on that. Before we dive into all of that, it would be great if you could just give us a little bit of background and who you are, what you do, and how you got interested in the science of intuition.
Yeah, so right now I'm a professor at a university, the University of New South Wales here in Sydney, Australia. My background's pretty all over the place. I actually went to art school for a while, was going to become a filmmaker, was into making digital shorts, really into that. And then towards the end of that degree, I started reading a lot about consciousness and trying to understand the nature of reality. And that pulled me away from that, from the film career, into psychology and neuroscience. And so I ended up changing everything, switching, doing a science degree, a PhD, going and working in the US for a few years before coming back to Australia. So that's kind of the 10-second version. So now I run a lab. It's called Future Minds Lab. We study intuition, decision making, mental imagery, aphantasia. And I guess we're probably best known for measuring things like intuition and mental imagery that are really hard to get a grasp on and really hard to measure, and figure out whole new ways of measuring them sort of objectively and reliably from the ground up. So I guess the origin story with intuition was, it's almost a decade ago now, so about 10, probably 9 years. The lab was studying sort of consciousness, and one of the ways we would do that is to suppress information outside of awareness. And then we try and measure how that unconscious information affects decisions, how it affects perception, behavior, all kinds of things. So we were already sort of almost studying intuition. And I had a new graduate student at the time who wanted to study intuition. And it was a really nice fit because we had the techniques we'd already developed to get information into the brain unconsciously. It was really then just the extra step of combining real-time decision making and also turning the unconscious information into something emotional. And I'm sure we can nerd out as much as you want into the details of how I operationalize intuition, how I define it, how we measure it in the lab, because not everyone will agree with that. But yeah, we developed a way to create intuition in the lab whenever we wanted, so we could study how the brain can sort of combine unconscious emotions, if you like, or feelings with very simple decisions in real time. And that really opened the door over the decade that followed into this whole realm of intuition. What is it? It was really a messy sort of state for intuition in psychology and neuroscience. Not many people were studying it. A few were. But the way they would study it was varied, from questionnaires through to very semantic tasks. And so, yeah, it sort of set my lab and me off in this new direction of thinking about intuition, thinking about a framework. Once there was a clear definition and I felt like we could measure it, the natural rules, practical rules for how to, think about intuition, when you should use it, when you shouldn't use it. So practical rules could help people. And that's what the second half of the book's really about. Sort of these 5 rules when you should or shouldn't use intuition. And back then, and for a lot of people still, there was this argument that intuition's good. Oh no, it's bad. We should use it. We shouldn't use it. It's unreliable. It's this, this system one thing, you always ignore it. And then other more alternative folks will be like, no, lean into it, trust it all the time. Once you understand what it is, what it's not, how the brain learns to use unconscious information, you realize it's neither of those two things. It's more of a gray area in between. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And for some topics you can, and some topics you can't. So that's sort of, the book was really about the science of it, understanding the way the brain processes unconscious information, how we can use that for decisions or actions, and then turning that into practical things that could really help people in any industry, doing anything from sport to the military to business decisions, to make better decisions and bring together these sort of two worlds, or the emotional feelings of decision making and the more rational, in sort of a guide that could help people. Yeah, so that's kind of the fairly brief version and the origin story.
It's a book that makes, I think, a very important contribution to our understanding. I presume scientists have been studying this for a little while. You've been at this for a while, but in the world I occupy. I kind of see this dichotomy. You know, you've got the people on the one hand who sort of go with your gut. What does your heart tell you? This sort of thing. This is how we need to decide. And then you've got the other side that sort of, well, no, yeah, intuition is bad, as you said. So we shouldn't listen to it. We need to play it down. And you dive into the nuance, which is fabulous. Before we do that, though, I'd love to just let's talk about what it is, the definition that you use.
The elephant in the room.
Sure.
So it's important that I have a very specific definition. So the way I define it, and I'll say why afterwards, is the learnt productive use of unconscious information for better decisions or actions, right? And there's a couple of choice keywords there that it's learnt. It's not something innate. That's more like an instinct or something. So we learn it. It's a dynamic response to the environment. And it's sort of utilizing unconscious information to improve decisions or actions. And that also is important, the improving bit. So what I wanted to do to clear up the kind of confusion and arguments in psychology was to say, look, I'm going to call intuition something that's the productive, positive use, if you like. And the times when intuition leads us astray, which there are, quite a few times, I'm going to coin a new word for that, misintuition, as in a misfiring of intuition, right? Every time I say that now, I think of a misintuition, competition kind of thing. Anyway, bad joke, I know, but anyway, I can't help but make that joke. So rather than arguing that it's good, it's bad, it's good, it's bad, the idea was to say, look, let's call intuition the productive use when it is useful. And these other times when you're falling for something else, let's call that something else. And that way we have better definitions. It clears up the field a little bit and we can move forward with the research. And I know that people will disagree a little bit with my definition. It sounds very clinical and very, narrow. For some people, intuition is a spiritual thing, or it's tapping into the energy of the universe, and all kinds of different definitions. And I'm not saying that's wrong at all. I'm saying for now, we've got this definition. I think it's the most useful for moving the scientific field forward. We can explain that with all the neuroscience data we already have. And also it's the most useful for building a practical guide for helping people make better decisions. And who knows, maybe tomorrow, next year sometime, or the year after, or 10 years, there'll be more discoveries and we'll have to change that definition. So it's a flexible definition. I'm not going to, stand on a hill and fight for it or anything like that. So it can adapt, but I thought we needed that clear definition, a working definition right now, to help build a science around it, because it's really a young science. There's not a lot of scientists working on it. Yeah. And then also to be more practical. So I'm not saying anyone else who has a different definition is wrong. I'm not trying to push science down their throat or anything like that. I just think for now, it's a useful way to define it for those reasons.
And I guess there are a couple of other words that you threw out there, insight and instinct. I think we lump intuition with all of these things, right? So if something just kind of strikes us, we're not quite sure where a thought comes from, we label that as intuition. Or we get a strong emotional response for whatever reason, we label that as intuition as well. We put it all in this sort of system one thinking. At least in my experience, when people talk about it, this is what I find people do. And it might be useful if you could just explain the difference between intuition and, say, insight, an impulse, these other things that people attribute to being intuition that may not.
Yeah. So maybe let's start with, I like to mention instincts, because people often use the word intuition and instinct interchangeably, but I think that's a bit of a mistake. So instincts are typically things that are hardwired, right? If I bite into a lemon, my face is going to screw up. And I would have done that when I was 1 week old. Those kind of reactions stay with us. So we're born with them and they're with us our whole lives. So they're hardwired. Whereas intuition is learning which things in the environment predict good or bad outcomes. So as you learn new things, as the environment changes, that is dynamic and that will change. And that's a very different thing to a hardwired instinct. And I know you're interested in uncertainty. So another example of an instinct would be how humans and primates react to uncertainty, right? So it's like a fear stimulus. People really, it almost hurts people more than others. And, once upon a time, that made a lot of sense when the world was simpler, right? That we wanted to stay away from all uncertainty. we sort of crave this certainty. In the modern world, especially right now with all the AI stuff that's coming at us every day, things are very uncertain. And it makes people very uncomfortable. They get stressed, they get anxious. So that would be sort of an instinct that once was adaptive and now it's sort of become maladaptive. So as the environment changes, that doesn't really change that much. And that's different from intuition. Then you have all the other things like cravings and emotions, and that sort of taps into some of the rules I've developed where there is emotional thinking, and we don't want to confuse that, right? If you're terrified to get on the airplane, that's not intuition. That's stress, anxiety, emotional thinking. That's something else going on there. Mm-hmm. Unless you're a pilot, an airline engineer or something, and you know a lot about, or a weather expert, and you know a lot about these things, and your intuition might be telling you something useful. In that case, it might be different. But for most of us, the fear of getting on a plane or the fear of swimming in the ocean and you're thinking about sharks is not intuition. That's something else going on there. And likewise, we don't want to confuse cravings for addictive things. That's actually sort of taps into one of my rules, right? Whether it be drugs and alcohol or gambling or social media or the pull to check my email right now, these kind of this pull that it feels attractive. I want to do these things. It feels natural. It feels good. And that's not intuition either. But sometimes that feeling can feel a bit like some types of intuition. But I wouldn't call that intuition either. I'd put that in a different category. And that's one of the issues. You mentioned system 1 and system 2, and I'm not a huge fan of that because system 1, if you just clump all these completely different things that are fast and reflexive or unconscious all together, they're just too different. They're heterogeneous. There's such different things in the brain. I don't think that's very scientific. I don't think it's particularly helpful. The brain doesn't really work like that either. So the idea of system 1, system 2 that Kahneman sort of made famous is not really based on brain architecture or brain function. It's sort of more just a categorical or a semantic way of thinking about ways in which we could make decisions or things that could drive us. But if you think about it, the things I've mentioned, like intuition, instinct, emotions, priming, I could prime you to behave in a certain way, all the cognitive biases that people may, will probably be aware of some of them at least. There are memory, there are visual illusions, memory illusions, all kinds of illusions which can drive behavior in ways we're not aware of. And all those things, there's a lot more. All those things are so different and have different brain architectures. They have different characteristics. And to clump them all together into one basket is not helpful at all. In fact, it's kind of takes us in the other direction. It takes us backwards scientifically. So that's the main reason I'm not a fan of the system 1, system 2. I know people love it and people are huge, most people are fans of it. But in terms of cognitive neuroscience and the way the brain works, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
I'm also not sure it does justice to some of the original intent because you get into these conversations where it's system 1 bad, system 2 good. And what we want to do is we want to get all the system 1 stuff out of the way and we want to dive into system 2. But then we start to think we're not robots and these sort of computational beings. In fact, you have an interesting anecdote in the book about someone who almost, if you could maybe break that down before I want to get into the rules and everything, but this is an interesting segue.
Yeah.
They almost couldn't make a decision because they sort of overanalyzed everything and couldn't integrate intuition and things of that nature. Maybe I've got that wrong, but I'm wondering if you could just share that because it's a super interesting anecdote, I think.
Yeah. So for most people, it turns out that feeling things is quite important. And so having a feeling behind a decision can really help you, particularly when they're similar things, can push you over the edge. And there's these famous cases with people having damage to a particular part of their brain, which the best way to think about that is that it sort of links the logical frontal cortex decision-making with more of the limbic systems, right? And if you kind of sever that or break that in some way, then it turns out people have a lot of trouble coming to quick decisions, and they'll and and they'll do long lists of pros and cons, and they just have a lot of trouble making decisions. And so, even if you try and push that so-called system 1 out of the way and try and ignore it, it's always going to be there, right? And you're always going to do things. We know from neuroscience now that we're all driven by unconscious information in our brains, some more than others. Whether that's when you get into the voting booth and you think logically you're going to vote for this person, you get in there and you feel this strong emotion and you vote this way, or you eating organic, healthy food and you're driving home on a road trip, and you just pull into a fast food place, right? And all of a sudden you're there, you're doing it and you're buying it and you want to, but you kind of don't want to. And these things drive us in ways we're not always aware of in many different, every day in many different ways. In the supermarket, the things at eye level, we're biased to look at and we'll be primed and we're more likely to purchase them because of where they are and the colors they are. And we're not aware of that. We don't think about that. We just do it. And so there's all these cases of that. So the unconscious absolutely drives our behavior. So I think we want to be aware of that. We want to understand it and track it, study it. But yeah, emotions are hugely important. And a lot of people would say without the feeling of emotions, good and bad, it's part of the quality of life. Yeah. So most people don't want to switch that off. They want to feel that juiciness of life when they're making decisions. They want to feel that reward when they've done something really nice. And so it's a huge part of the quality of our lives.
And our brains are taking in all kinds of information all the time that we're not conscious of. And we're doing it now. I'm looking at you. I have a sense of what's going on around me. I'm thinking about the conversation. There's so many things, so many cues, and we're not aware of that. But I guess what you're talking about, I want to get into your rules here, but it is about figuring out how to tap that reservoir. Is that a little bit what?
Yeah, absolutely. So it often helps to go through sort of a couple of examples. So I often talk about walking to a restaurant or a cafe, right? And like you said, you walk into a restaurant and immediately your brain, your eye, you're processing what the staff are wearing, their haircuts, the music, how clean the tablecloths are, what the temperature is, what the different smells in the air might be, the decor, what color the ceiling is, what, the spider webs, and 100 or 1,000 other things. And you're not logically looking around the room, sort of, ticking off boxes and thinking about it, but your brain processes all that in a second or two, right? And I think the best way to think about intuition is all the different times you've been to cafes or restaurants, your brain has learned which of those things predict good or bad food, good or bad coffee, whatever it might be. So the moment, and that's the learning part, right? So you've got to go to the cafes, go to the restaurants. If you've never been to one before, you can't have that learning. So the learning's important. So when you've all that learning's happened already and you walk in there, your brain's like red flagging or green flagging, good place, bad place, but you're not logically, consciously thinking through that. You'll just have a feeling, oh, maybe not here, let's go to the other place, or like, yeah, this place, I like it. Yeah, let's sit down here. Right. And that's all happening under the hood, happening in the background. And we get a feeling which counters and comes up with the logical, rational decision making. And that's what intuition is, that's driving. So whether you're in a cafe, you're meeting a new person, you're climbing Everest, which is one of the stories in the book, right? You're processing all these extra cues, right? Neuroscientists will use the analogy of the iceberg, that we're really only consciously aware of that tip of the iceberg sticking out of the water, and the bulk of it's under the water. So the bulk of what our senses are processing remains unconscious. And then on the top of that, you have the spotlight of attention, what you pay attention to, what you don't pay attention to. So a lot of stuff, it gets processed. If it's important based on prior learning, it'll flag. We'll feel that. And the reason people talk about it as this gut response, right? We feel it in our bodies, mostly in the gut, right? It's not about the microbiome. It's not about the things that the neurotransmitters in the gut. It's about that bodily sensation. That's called interoception, right? Which is just a fancy word for internal perception, right? Interoceptions, am I too hot or too cold or hungry? Need to go to the bathroom. And so it's pretty interesting because what our body is really doing, it's tapping into unconscious information in our brain. So even though I'm not aware of those things, my body will respond to them. So I can take you into the lab. I can show you a scary picture of a snake or a spider. I can render that image unconscious through one of our nifty techniques. You'll never see it, but I can then measure, you'll start sweating slightly more. Your heart will beat ever so slightly faster. So your body's responding to things that you are not conscious of, which is a funny way to say it. All that's in your brain, but your body gets access to it and you don't, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. And so I want to get into the frameworks, and you mentioned there how you study it. Perhaps we could touch on that too. It was always read and understood that, look, you've got this thing, and you can tell me how and why this is wrong, and we can get into the nuance of it. But you have this thing called intuition. It's good if you're working on, and you do talk about this, but a repeated task that you've got some deep expertise in. So, uh, the stories of surgeons who've done lots of surgeries and they can kind of sense that something's off. So they should make a decision based on intuition, or the famous stories of the firefighters who they're in a building and they get out just before it blows up because they sense something. So these are repeated contexts in which there's some deep expertise. And I was sort of understood, or I've understood it, people explaining it, that look, if you're in one of those situations, go with your gut, listen to your intuition. And if you're not, though, ignore it. So, right. So, but it's much more nuanced,
exactly.
much more complicated than that. And maybe we can, as an opportunity to get into your five rules. But yeah,
but I think that the mastery, as I talk about it in the book, that's part of this SMILE acronym, the M for mastery, that you do need to have the experience, right? That your brain has to learn the relationship between all these subtle cues in any environment and what do they mean? Are they going to predict a good thing or a bad thing? And that's associative learning. People are probably aware, remember Pavlov's dogs from school or from university, right? So your brain's learning the association between these different things. So you need to put in the time. You need to become somewhat of an expert, whether that's in the office, in the military, looking for different things, or playing sport, or a firefighter. But you need to put in the time. You need to give, your brain has to learn these things. And that's really important. Now, how much learning is a much harder thing to answer, because learning's not linear, right? The whole 10,000 hour rule that Malcolm Gladwell made famous, not a real thing at all. It's not like every hour you become, 1 unit more of an expert at something. And you can, the rule of thumb really is the more emotional or the higher the consequences of the thing, the stronger the learning. So if you're in a car accident, you can have very strong learning. So you can actually develop post-traumatic stress disorder, which is basically learning that's too strong, more or less, in a moment. So when the outcomes are really severe and emotional, that learning, you don't need, 1 or 2 instances. If it's going to a coffee shop and it's just about good or bad coffee, you're going to need a lot of learning. You're going to need hundreds or thousands of examples of going to cafes and absorbing those cues and seeing what they predict. So I think that's the best way to think about learning. It's really, the emotion or the pain of the outcome, and also how the time gap between that. So if you do something and you got to wait 6 months for an outcome, it's also going to be very hard to learn that. If you do something and, you get tackled and you're playing football or whatever it is straight away, that learning is going to be very rapid because you got the feedback immediately. So the emotionality, the strength, and the timing are sort of the big levers there into figuring out how much learning you need to get mastery for something before you practice intuition.
Right. So you don't need to be like this deep expert necessarily. You do need learning, but you don't need to, it's a sliding scale.
Yeah. It's going to depend on the situation, a number of factors, but you definitely need some level of mastery, let's say. Yeah.
Right. Already that's useful. That's your second rule. And also, I guess, if
so we
it's something
skipped over S.
Yeah, no, it's good. Just talking. Let's maybe stay on this one for a moment. But just your framework is self-awareness, mastery, impulses and addiction, low probability, and environment. But let's just stick on the mastery one, and we can come back and walk through. Also, so if you're doing something completely novel, right, and you're nervous, and your brain, your body saying this is you don't like this, and maybe it's something slightly dangerous. Maybe it's, I don't know, you're going skydiving for the first time or something. The way to look at that is not necessarily, you just don't necessarily read too much into your intuition. Is that a good heuristic?
Because of the adrenaline and the emotion of
yeah.
So that's really the S, like self-awareness, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we know there's a range of things. We know there's data on the fact that if you're anxious, you have anxiety or depression, like clinical anxiety or depression, you should absolutely not rely on your intuition at all. We know that that's, those conditions really mess with the decision making, but particularly intuition. But also acutely, if you've just had a breakup or something, you've got some bad news, you're feeling emotional, or positive, you just won the lottery, something, really ecstatic, don't use your intuition either, right? Because it's going to, your body's going to be dumped with this strong emotion, and it's going to be really hard to know where that emotion is coming from. We're not very good at that. And it's also just going to flood the system, and it's going to be hard to tap into those more subtle feelings of intuition. So for the skydiving example, absolutely. If you've never done it before, you're going to be probably anxious and stressed and worried, and that's going to make it really hard to tap into any intuition. But again, if you've never been skydiving before either, I wouldn't say just don't trust your intuition around the skydiving, because you don't have anything to base that on. You haven't given your brain the chance to learn which things about the height of the plane or the wind or whatever it might be, the type of parachute. You haven't learned anything about that. So anything you're feeling is going to be more like that anxiety getting on a plane or something. It's going to be emotional thinking or stress or anxiety, and that's not intuition. You want to try and separate those two things. So the advice I typically give is, if you're in a state like that and you can acutely bring yourself back down to baseline, and there are ways to do this, the box breathing, different relaxation things, try and do that. You need to cultivate self-awareness of your emotional state, right? We think of that as part of emotional intelligence. So first step is really to be aware of your emotional state. Am I in a good state or not? If not, then try and bring that down. And there's, like I said, there's things you can do acutely, but there's also things you can do daily or weekly. And that sort of goes into all, sleep and diet and all kinds of exercise, all that good stuff. But yeah, if you're in an aroused state, if you're stressed, anxious, really excited, hold off on using intuition. And if you have to make a decision, stick to the rational logic, the numbers, until you've settled back down again. Right. And in the book, I tell a story from many years ago when I was on a first date, and we went to one of those indoor rock climbing gyms. And it was this, it was amazing. The chemistry was on fire. We were climbing and falling and belaying and catching and then swapping over. And we fell for each other. The chemistry was amazing. Next time we met up, not so much. Time after, again, nothing. And it was really odd. And it stuck with me for years afterwards. And then one day I realized it was something called arousal misattribution.
Okay.
So humans are just really bad at understanding where our feelings come from. So in that example, maybe like skydiving, we were confusing all the adrenaline, excitement from being, hanging on the rope with our response to each other. And there's lots of data on this now that, we just don't know where some of these feelings come from. So we get them confused. And so when it comes to intuition as well, you're going to confuse where these certain feelings are coming from. So we need to be very careful and aware of that.
Yeah, and I think we're not generally as a population. I'm speaking also as a male. We're not that great at identifying emotions, right? We're not very good at figuring out like, oh, I'm not happy here, but is it anger? Is it disgust? Is it what are the what's the color palette going on here? Do you think that also can play a role in making not using intuition?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, sadly, emotional intelligence has been on decline for I think about the last decade, and that has actually been a few papers have linked that to tech use and social media in particular. And I think a big part of that is people are just not realizing when they're getting upset, when they're angry, until it's almost too late, until they're really angry. We're not noticing the change in our physiology and how we're feeling. And I was in India just the last couple of weeks, and I noticed there a lot of the people I met there were acutely aware of their emotional state. And I found that fascinating, that you could say that part of their self-awareness, that part of emotional intelligence was really tuned in. The second their states were elevated, they would say something and they would just bring themselves back down. Typically don't witness that at that level, here in Australia or in the US. So I think that's something, really important. Generally speaking, when you give questionnaires to men and women report using intuition more, and that has been linked to more emotional thinking. Sometimes people have linked that to what's called more magical thinking. So there's questionnaires that measure these things, and generally speaking, women tend to score higher on what's called magical thinking, except when it comes to things like sports and gambling. And then men typically score off, they sort of hit the ceiling on these magical, they cross their fingers and legs, then their team's going to win in the game or whatever it is. And that's an interesting way to think about that. But I think I haven't seen any good data on linking, the physiological responses in men and women to intuition. But it's something, we're certainly interested in studying more of.
Do you follow or have you read Rory Sutherland's book, Alchemy?
Huge fan, love it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And he has a thing there about how we believes, and you can kind of see this in advertising because advertising hacks this a lot, marketing, advertising, all the stuff that we actually make most of our decisions emotionally, and then we use the rational part to justify it or explain it. That's more like, that's the PR department, if you like. So, you know, why did you buy this car? I said, well, it's fuel efficient and blah, blah, blah. But really, you know, we may have bought it because it's cool, right? And I'm just wondering if you, what's the science behind that? What's going on there?
I mean, we we're talking before about how the, you know, unconscious things drive behavior, and they absolutely do. And I was talking about, you know, whether you're trying to eat healthy and then you go off and hit the fast food joints, or, you know, you say you're going to vote for this person socially, and then when you're in the privacy of the voting booth, you go the other way. But I think often, we will just do things on the spur of the moment, and then it's not till later when someone asks, "Oh, why did you do that?" You're going to go, "Oh, shit. Because I thought that I needed to give myself a break." And it is. That's like the press office versus the executive office, because I think maybe it was Jonathan Haidt that originally came up with that really nice metaphor that we will just do things in the moment. Things will drive our behavior, and then afterwards we'll come up with a logical explanation for why we did this or why we didn't do that. And I think it fits pretty well. Like we can prime people in the lab to change their behavior. We can make them way more likely to choose A over B. They don't know we're doing that, kind of like the supermarkets do or the website do with this sort of these nudging things that are very popular at the moment. And people have no idea that's going on, right? And I think this speaks to a lot of the free will discussions that have also been going around. I don't think we have any free will, because when you reduce some level of free will by controlling people's behavior, by biasing them and priming them to behave in very particular ways, you can't feel that. There's no difference in feeling. And so I think we feel like we have agency over ourselves, particularly after the event. And I don't think we have that much agency. I think we can when we really focus. So I think, the Rory stuff is pretty spot on there in terms of behavior, in terms of advertising, getting people to feel certain things, getting them to behave in certain ways. Like there are long lists of ways of doing that, which are sort of the go-tos for advertisers.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned there, you said we can exercise free will when we really focus. And is that what you mean by
agency? We can increase.
Right.
I don't think there's any evidence we have free will.
Right.
Like it's probably a controversial statement, maybe not, depends who the audience, you know, who's listening. But when you start thinking about all that, so let's put aside the, you know, quantum mechanics or, you know, the universe thing and the physics and all that. Let's just talk about biology for a moment. When you layer in all the things that control our behavior, from our genetics, from the hormones in the womb, from all the behavioral stuff when we're young, and then things right now, how caffeinated I am, like the food I've eaten today, what exercise all these things influence us. How I'm primed by something I did 15 minutes ago. You know, there's all these levels of things which we now know clearly from science that do control our behavior. We have no idea any of those are happening. So we can't feel agency, we can't feel free will, or we can't feel when it's gone or when it's there. We also know from clinical psychology that if you don't feel it, it's really bad. So a lot of depression and a lot of mental health situations people will feel like a loss of agency. So we know it's really important to feel like we do have control and agency over ourselves. So I think it's more like an illusion, that it's crucially important to feel like we have it, completely independent of whether we have it or not. Right? And I haven't seen any convincing evidence from anywhere that we have free will. The fact that it feels like we do is neither here nor there. It's better to think of that as an illusion that is really important to who we are, our mental health, and all kinds of things, motivation. But there's certainly no evidence I've seen that we actually have free will. And I don't think it matters. Well, you could say that it does matter for some things, and for the legal system and for punishment, it does matter. But for a lot of other things, it doesn't matter. So as long as we feel like we do, that seems to be what's important psychologically.
Okay, that's interesting and great. I'm just thinking of I don't know, the listener who's some sort of business executive who's like, we make decisions all the time. Of course, we have free will, this sort of thing. But you're talking about this at I think at a much more profound level.
Really, the low level. What are the I can take you into the lab and have you choose A or B, and I can predict based on that activity in your brain, about 10 seconds before you make that choice, what you're going to choose. Right? And I can do that with EEG outside the head. I can do that with fMRI, looking at the activity inside your head. So there's studies like that. And again, I'm not predicting 100% what you're going to do, but well above chance. It's clearly significant. So there's a lot of research like that. But I don't think we should just all sit back and go, oh, it's just all fate. I'm not going to do anything.
Right.
Because what you do is part of the thing that primed you and the part of your upbringing and a part of, 500,000 other things that happened that year that are all contributing in very small ways. And the fact that those things are controlling what I do and who I am, I don't think it matters that much because it doesn't feel like it.
Yeah.
And so it's a very complex thing to pass, and a lot of people freak out when you say there's no free will, but I don't think there's any reason to freak out because it's very important to feel like we do either way.
Yeah. Okay. Very, very interesting. So we've got self-awareness. Mastery was the second one. Just on that, you talk about a thing called associative learning, which is that the Pavlov's dog thing, and that is
just the way the brain process.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. And that just to underline that, it's a type of learning which is automatic. It's not like practicing playing tennis over and over and you're really trying hard to learn. The brain will learn associations with things and you don't have to do anything. It just happens automatically. It can happen unconsciously. And so things that either happen together and the neurons firing together in the brain will become associated, or this thing that predicts this other thing later in time will also become linked, and your brain will start to learn this thing predicts that thing. And that's that sort of red flag, green flag thing in the cafe or the restaurant I was talking about. And so, your brain learns things that are simultaneous or happening later in time, which things come together, which things predict which things. And you don't have to put any effort into that. It just really happens automatically. Right. Our brains are sort of wired and built to do that.
Right. I want to move through some of the other rules. And one is impulses and addiction. Never mistake impulsive desires for intuitive thoughts. And I'm wondering if you could touch on that a little bit. We have already, but what was so I listened to you on the Rich Roll podcast, and he talks about addiction a lot. I listened to the show, and when he talks about addiction, he sort of says, well, we're all kind of addicted to something in some way. And when I think about, for example, social media use, right? These apps are designed to be addictive. And I'm just wondering if you could, first of all, explain that rule. And then also, what's an addiction? What is an unhealthy, how do I know that I might not be making the right decision because I'm addicted to this app? How do we know that we shouldn't be relying on our intuition because we've got some sort of addictive behavior going?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think let's just say pretty much all of us are addicted to something in some way, whether it's coffee or, for most young people, it's social media these days. And we've seen the numbers in the US, 5 hours a day on TikTok or Instagram, but mostly TikTok these days. And the drive, the pull towards these things can be very strong. And so the rule around the eye and smile is not to confuse any cravings or feelings or the pull towards something as intuition, right? So as I'm talking to you, my brain will start ticking over and going, I'm getting the feeling I got an important email. I better check my email, and that's, because I'm slightly addicted to the emails, intermittent rewards. And that's kind of the idea behind, addiction and the way slot machines work and the way social media works. And so I can convince myself pretty easily that my intuition is telling me that I should check my email because for some reason it's processed all this information and it knows an important email or a post on social media is going to get a lot of attention or something, and I need to check it, right? And that's not the case. That's not intuition. That is the addictive pull that's pulling me towards the thing, right? And that's the same for any kind of drug. It's the same for food, which we can get into, which is a controversial one, addictive foods. and intuitive eating. Crucially to the point, so intuition is typically positive and negative, right? I can feel a really good response to someone when I meet them, or I can feel something not quite right. I can feel a heavy sinking feeling, or some people might feel intuition in their fingertips or their sweaty palms. So intuition goes both ways, whereas addictive things are normally just a pull towards the thing. I need to check my socials. I know I want to take another hit of that drug, or I want to eat some more donuts, whatever it is. I want more, more, more. And so it's very lopsided. It's not sort of positive and negative. And that's one of the easy ways to tell. So if you're getting a strong pull towards something, that's probably not intuition. That's probably something else. That's the addictive systems in our brain. That's once that reward, that craving starting to kick in, and you're going to get pulled towards that. Now, try and mention intuitive eating, because there was a whole movement about intuitive eating, and there's a bunch of books on that. And the idea behind that, very briefly, is the idea that you just let yourself go, eat whatever you want, whatever feels right, eat it, and just eat as much as you want of whatever you want. I'm kind of paraphrasing, it's not exactly like that, and then eventually you'll sort of work your way out and you'll come to an equilibrium if you just let yourself go and follow those intuitive feelings. That kind of works if you're on a whole food diet or you're living on a farm and, it's all simple, non-processed food. We know that millions or even billions of dollars have gone into highly processed food and then hiding sugars and salts and all kinds of other things in there to make it highly palatable and make it basically addictive. And a lot of people talk about modern processed foods like a drug. They are addictive. And so I think it's very dangerous to try and eat modern processed foods intuitively and just pull the pin and just eat as much as you want, because you're not going to stop. So I'll sort of make a difference there between modern processed foods and more whole food, simple diet out on a farm. That's probably fine to be intuitive around that kind of eating. But anything that's highly processed and addictive, bad idea. Just, don't. So that's my take on intuitive eating.
Yeah. You talk about this concept of a broken compass around addiction.
Yeah.
It sort of breaks your intuitive powers, become, I guess, diminished.
Yeah. Again, it's kind of like depression and anxiety. When you have a strong addiction, like a drug addiction, your decision making goes out the window. And there's a lot of science on this. We've seen a lot of data that people will. So there's a lot of experiments that trade off getting something now versus holding off and getting more later. So how much extra of the thing do you need to wait? I can give you, hey, Ben, I can give you $5 today, but if you wait 2 months, I'll give you $80 or $100 or whatever it is, right? And so how much more do I have to give you to equate now and later? And people who have addictions or suffering addiction they need so much more later on to not choose the now option. They just want to choose now, go. And that's one of the hallmarks of addiction, that this impulsive decision making. Anyone who's suffering addiction needs to be very careful with their decision making. And I would not recommend trying to follow any intuition around their decision making. I think it's very dangerous. Yeah.
So if it feels like it is a compulsion, it's a sort of like the siren's call or something that we want to be doing, right? That's not intuition. That's not what's going on here. It's something else that might be drawing us into doing a particular activity. Is that
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's the pull towards, rather than the intuition can be positive or negative. Yeah. But sometimes it can be hard to tell. And that's why I sort of have this blanket rule. Just don't use intuition for anything addictive.
Right. Okay. I want to canter through the final two rules. The next one is low probability. And what's interesting, because this, and I think some of my listeners will feel relieved by this one, because they sort of say that, you shouldn't, intuition to do math, basically, to do probabilistic thinking. But what's interesting to me was, so you introduced this Monty Hall problem. I've taught that in courses, but a few years ago in courses and presentations, I sort of tried to explain it. Then when I read that section of the book, I was like, oh yeah, I know this. And I didn't, because I walked through it intuitively versus actually thinking it through. So I came across that story, which maybe people may have heard of it. And I thought, oh yeah, it's this one. Oh yeah, she should stay. And then I was like, oh no, it's wrong, because I was thinking about it intuitively versus
This is the game show
actually
one.
like
the game show.
the game show one. Yeah, the game show one. So maybe we just talk through that. But I haven't read that or haven't thought about that one for a few years. Came back to it. My intuition was thinking what I should do, and then I was like, "Oh, that's the wrong answer." It's a super interesting lesson.
I mean, yeah, there's so many examples of how we get probabilities wrong in psychology. It's just it can be just so counterintuitive or just messes. We're just bad at it. So the Monte Carlo, not Monte Carlo, the Monty Hall,
yeah,
problem or thing, as it's named after a game show host from the 70s and 80s. Yeah. So the basic setup is you have, let's say, 3 boxes, and there's going to be a set of car keys in one of the boxes. Okay. And so you're faced with these 3 boxes and you make a choice, and let's say it's A, B, and C, and I choose A. And then the game show host goes, interesting choice. Now, I'm going to show you under one of the other boxes. And of course, they're going to pick the box which doesn't have the thing in it, the car keys in this case. So they show the empty box, and you're like, okay. And then there's a box you've chosen and one other box. And the idea is, should you stick with your original choice or should you change? Right? And a lot of people feel like they should change. And it turns out mathematically, you should always stick with your original choice.
Right.
And even going over this now, then I start to think like, wait a second, I got this right.
I got that right. Yeah.
No, it's every, and like every time I wrote this, I was like, I better double check because it is really confusing and our brains get this wrong. The probabilities kind of sort of move across to the boxes, the remaining boxes, and you should stick with, so it goes from 30%, 33% to 66% or whatever. And you should absolutely stick with your original choice. Yeah. And you can't feel that at all, right?
Yeah. I actually thought it was that you should change, but now I'm like,
now you've messed with my head as well.
Yeah, no. But this just demonstrates the point, right? Like we have to do the workings, right? Like you
got to work it through.
You've got to do that. You have to do the. Yeah. If there's probabilities.
Now you've
involved,
messed with my head. Yeah.
No. The whole thing, messed with my head because I looked.
I want to look it up and check in.
Yeah. We'll get that right in the show notes. But I think it demonstrates, if we're thinking about probabilities and maths and things like that, you have to do the workings, right? And so it proves your rule, right? That it shouldn't be when we practice intuition and it comes to probabilities, we need to go through it carefully, go through the numbers carefully. That's exactly so I think it's a great example of.
And the other one, the Monte Carlo one, which I thought you were going with beginning was the gambler's fallacy, right?
Yeah, the gambler's fallacy. Yeah.
You're playing roulette and it's black, 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 black. And you're like, the next one, as you see more of the same, more blacks, you feel like it has to be red now.
Yeah.
And it's really hard not to feel that. But even though each spin is completely independent of the last one, it just feels wrong and you see that in betting that when there's many, many reds in a row or blacks in a row, that everyone will start betting the opposite way. And it's a total fallacy. Each spin is independent of the last. So that's another example. But just generally speaking, we just shouldn't use any intuition for probabilistic thinking, and definitely anything low probability. And you can think about that in terms of, climate change or smoking, the probability of getting sick, cancer from smoking, or trying to understand the probabilities of dying from a virus or whatever it is, right? Our feelings can lead us astray. Or sometimes in Australia, we'll call this the shark attack rule, right? You're swimming in the ocean and I just start talking about sharks or Jaws or something, and you start imagining a fish, a shark underneath you, and you're terrified. Doesn't matter how much you remind yourself, the probability of encountering a shark is so low that it's, you're more likely to be injured by a kangaroo in Australia than a shark. Driving to the beach is so much more dangerous than swimming at the beach in terms of sharks. And it doesn't matter. Once you get that emotion in there and you have a mental image of the shark, you will ignore those probabilities. They go out the window. So that's another kind of example of, in lots of different ways, we just don't get probabilities. We don't understand rules around large numbers. So because I talk about intuition a lot, often it comes up this idea of premonitions, and people will say, I had a dream about airplane crashing, and then one then there was an incident the next day, a plane crashed or something, and it foresaw it. It must be meaningful. And then you run the numbers. We all dream 5, 6, 7 times a night, whatever it is. And there's that many billion people on the globe, or just how many people there are in one country. And you run the numbers, there's a high probability of dreaming about emotional things as well. And we realize that every time there's a plane crash, we should absolutely expect that quite a few people dreamt about a plane crash the night before. And that's our baseline where we're starting from. So that's what we should expect. And it's hard to let that sink in because of this thing called apophonia, where we're drawn to patterns, we see patterns in things, and we put meaning into it, right? And it doesn't matter that I know this for a fact. If I dreamt about an airplane crash and one happened, I will be like, oh, it must have meaning. We want to put meaning into these things, even if there's none there. So that's another way it's hard for us to understand numbers.
Yeah. And I think there's a part of us that sort of says, especially if it's very low probability, we dismiss it. So if someone says there's a 5% chance of something happening, once a year, we kind of like, but actually when you think about it over 20 years, the likelihood that thing will happen is almost, it approaches 100% because, 5 is 1 in 20. So, eventually, the probability is quite high, and we shouldn't dismiss it. So it's another example. And then lastly, environment. So we talked a little bit about that, but repeatable, predictable environments. You talk about something called context dependent memory, maybe we touch on that. I am conscious of time, but I do want to touch on one other thing before we start to wrap up. But maybe before we do that, just talk to us a little bit about the environment piece in the SMILE framework.
Yeah. So crucially, the kind of learning, remember I mentioned associative learning as this sort of the backbone of intuition. Your brain learns, associates the cues, the environment with good or bad outcomes. Now that kind of learning, as is most learning, is context specific. So what does that mean? It means when you're learning these things, it's not just the thing, it's the physical environment. Right. And this is important for, if someone's cramming for an exam and they're studying at home in their bedroom or their office, when they go into the exam room, it's much harder to remember that stuff because your brain imprints not just the information, but where you are when you're learning. And there's these really cool old experiments where they actually had people scuba dive down to, it was actually Oban up in Scotland, to the bottom of the ocean. They learnt words, they recalled them up on the surface versus recalling them back down in the water. They're better when they go back down in the water than they are on the surface. But if you learn them on the surface, you're better on the surface than you are underwater. So in other words, when you learn stuff, where you are imprints on that. And that becomes important for intuition because if you've spent, your life honing your intuition in your office, in the boardroom, and then all of a sudden, either you're traveling for work or you're working from home during COVID, for example, that context is going to be different. So some of that learned intuition, those associations between different things won't transfer that well to the different location. And that's why we need to be on the lookout and important. And this is one of the things I find really hard to follow when I'm traveling. I mentioned I was in India last time, and in those situations, I find it really hard to not just fall back to my intuitions, right? Because the language is different, the body language is different, the intonations in language is different. It's very hard to read people. I can fall for the trap of just thinking, oh, they mean this when they actually mean something totally different. So I've got to try and suppress some of my intuition in those situations because it's going to lead me astray. So when we change context like that, it invalidates some of the learning, and we have to be very careful with that. And also, it's not just the physical environment, it's the internal environment. So the old joke, you come home drunk and throw your keys on the table or somewhere, and then the next morning you wake up and you can't find your keys, you have a drink, and it comes back to you. And there's something to that, right? The internal state, if you're intoxicated, if you're highly caffeinated, if you're depressed or anxious, those internal states also imprint and change the memory. So if you've honed your intuition in a very calm state, it also won't transfer that well to a high, intensity situation, which is a big deal for some people making, big decisions, make or break, or, going to the Olympics as an example, where all the training may have been much calmer situations. And so in those situations, you want to actually practice and train your intuition in a similar way to where you're going to be performing under high stress. So that's an interesting way to think about it as well, both the physical environment and the external and internal.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, I give the example of Steve Jobs, who everyone will know from Apple, who was a huge fan of intuition, talked about it a lot, actually went to India at one point to study intuition and mystical things. And he said he used it for Apple. And he honed that in his workplace for designing products and some business decisions. But then in his home life, and particularly with his health decisions later in his life, he made some poor decisions. Everyone pretty much agrees that him putting off surgery for his cancer that eventually killed him, he made some, everyone more or less agrees that if he had the surgery early on, he would have survived, but he chose not to. And he had bad feelings about surgery and being invaded and all these kinds of things. And I think that's a sort of a poignant example of where intuition can be very spot on and strong in one situation and not transfer that well to a very different situation. So that's kind of the important rule there with the E, is to, be aware of the environment. If you've changed your environment, hold back or try and, focus on or think about your intuition. Don't just default to using it the way you normally would, or maybe suppress it if you're in a completely different environment.
That's, again, fascinating stuff. The travel part is really interesting because if we're in a new environment, it's almost natural to link what we don't know to what we do know, but we also learn that way too, right? So if we make a faux pas, and to your mistake point, I'm never going to do that again, because that was not the reaction that I wanted by using, I don't know, a gesture or something that it may not mean the same thing. I do want to touch on, you mentioned that intuition has never been more important for business and for organizations and organizational decision making. And I'm wondering, a lot of what we talk about here is about individual decision making, I suspect. And I'm just wondering how, if we move to a group setting, how groups can make, good or bad decisions based on harnessing the collective power of intuition. Wondering if you've got, what your thoughts are on there.
So once we're in a group and there's the social dynamics going on, that will affect decision making in ways that obviously aren't there if you're by yourself. And when you hear other people's opinions, it will sway yours, and you have these group dynamics and quite a thing. And if you think about decision making in teams of humans, and then decision making in teams of, let's say, humans and AIs, and it gets very interesting and complex very quickly. But that's a really interesting question. How do things change at scale? I think the fundamental would be to apply the 5 rules at the individual level and then at a group level. If something has recently happened, globally or to the whole company, that would be, increasing anxiety, stress, or the uncertainty around something. Am I going to have a job or not? Then that's going to throw off intuitive decision-making across the board. And so you would want to, as a leader, sort of say something about that and people to not follow their intuition. Again, if you're changing environments, taking on a new project or in a totally new field, you want to wait and make sure teams develop mastery before they start becoming, making intuitive decisions about what they're doing. So give that some time to develop mastery. And again, changing the environment also plays in there. If you're traveling or in a totally different environment there. So I guess there's a lot of the same things that would apply at the individual level will apply at a group level. It's interesting. That was another reason I wanted to write the book, because, I work with people sort of at the C-suite level leadership, and they would tell me, of course I use intuition. I have to. There's no, I haven't got time to do anything else. And I have ambiguous information, and I follow through, and I say, oh, do you discuss that publicly or with the board or anything? And I say, oh, no. It's too woo-woo. They won't trust that. And that was, right. So there's still a bit of, and it's changing a bit, but it's still a bit taboo for a public CEO to admit they've made an intuitive decision, right? They're not going to want to do that. And so that was another reason for writing the book and trying to build a science around this, so that if anyone in any kind of leadership position, political or business, if the 5 rules are met, if they have expertise, if they're in a calm, good state, then they can use your intuition, and they, and they can say that publicly. They can say, why not? Right? I'm an expert in this. I've honed my intuition over years, right? I was in this state, this, it wasn't this. I was in a familiar environment. It wasn't a low probability thing. I wasn't going to fall for the trick of numbers. So yeah, my goal was to build the science around that so that could be more openly discussed and people wouldn't have to sort of keep it.
Yeah, it demystifies it, which is fabulous. I was thinking about there's also the superstar CEO who almost leverages the mystique of intuition. Think about Jack Welch, or you've got others who sort of, I have this special power. I have intuitive powers that allow me to see things that you guys can't see. And so what I love about your book is that it demystifies a lot of that, so that either side is not, either extreme isn't ones in which we get lured. Just before we go, I would love to just leave my listeners with, you talk about the practice of intuition, maybe one or two things that people can do to start to practice, apart from picking up a copy of your book. What are some of the things people can do on a, almost a daily basis to start practice using?
I'm a huge fan. So first, try and absorb the 5 rules. And at first, you're going to have to write them down or print out the poster from the book that's on my website, and get used to following those. It's like you'll very quickly absorb those. It will become pretty automatic and you'll memorize them pretty fast. So follow the 5 rules. And then I'm also a fan of practicing with smaller decisions. So a lot of people, when they're faced with something, move to a different country, get divorced, get married, or buy a house, sell a house, all of a sudden the emotion comes up and they start talking about intuition. Right. And they're big decisions. So I'm a fan of practicing with smaller decisions, getting used to what it feels like. What does it feel like? Where do I feel in my body? Different people feel it in different places. Learning to link that feeling with the decision and the outcome, even maybe keeping track of decisions. So we want to build an app at some stage to do this. We haven't yet. Use a spreadsheet or just jot down, what were the options? What did it feel like? Where did you feel it? What did you decide? Were you happy later on? How does that, and then can you improve that over time? Can you get used to that interoceptive sensation of tapping into your body, right? There's big individual differences there. Some people can sit there and tap their finger and they can feel their heartbeat and tap out their heartbeat. Other people have no idea what their heart's beating when they're just sitting still. So we have differences in how much we can feel internally. So practicing that feeling, linking it to decision-making, try and practice it on a daily basis with safe, small decisions. So when the big ones come up, you know what to do and you know that you can trust your intuition because you've practiced it, you've followed these rules, you know the rules. So that's how I like to think about it and phrase that as like a daily practice.
Fabulous. Joel, this has been great. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me and my listeners. The book is called The Intuition Toolkit. It has a different name in the UK.
Yeah.
Should know
it's just
what
intuition,
that means.
single title.
Intuition.
The UK
it's just
book.
intuition. Yeah. So people can get that wherever books are sold. For people that have enjoyed this and want to learn more about you and your work and want to follow you, what are the best places to do that?
So I'm Prof. Joel Pearson on most platforms, Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube. We're going to start doing a lot more videos. We're doing some short form ones at the moment, but we're going to start doing long form, both into intuition, decision making, future research, but also aphantasia, mental imagery, and how all these things combine. And I'm working on a new book now on AI and how we can, the human side of AI, not AI itself, but how it's going to affect us. It's going to change our lives. How can we adapt to that? Almost like a change management piece around that. So I think that's an important new thing. So if you're interested in those questions, also give me a follow.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd love to have you back to talk about AI once your book is out, because that's I think we're feeling our way through it, but there are those that seem to be using it to outsource thinking, and there are those that are using it to complement creativity, and it's very interesting.
It's going to change everything, and it's going to change. And humans aren't always great with large scale change like that. And so we
right.
Even if AI is utopianly amazing, we're going to need help managing our way through the next decade of radical change, basically. And then there's the worst case scenarios where AI, causes all kinds of upset. Right. So either way, we're going to need help understanding the psychological side and how we're vulnerable, how we get AI wrong, how it's going to affect us. So I think it's an important question that not enough people are talking about. So be my pleasure.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking time once again. Wish you the best with your work, and hopefully we'll chat again soon.
Sounds good, Ben. My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thanks for supporting the science. Thanks for supporting the mission of intuition that I'm on to build up the science there. So thanks a lot.
No, congrats on the book once again. Bye for now.